These are devotions for people at a social distance. One of my favorite Psalms, one of the Psalms I keep coming back to, is not one that people often think of. It is Psalm 82. And this psalm is really interesting, fascinating to me because it offers a picture and a way of thinking about God that defies many of our assumptions about ancient Israelite religion and the view of God that is presented in the Bible. God in this passage is seen sitting in judgment, interacting with other gods. So verse 1 goes like this: God has taken his place in the divine council. In the midst of the gods, he holds judgment. So God is sitting in judgment on other gods, which is not necessarily how we picture and imagine God. But this was not an uncommon way to think of God for the people of the Old Testament. Now, as you continue to read the passage, you quickly find out that these other gods that God is interacting with are pretty clearly representing the gods of the various nations. So if we're sitting around a board table, we have, over here the god of Egypt, and over here the god of Babylon, and over here the god of the Greeks, and so on. So there is a representative basically for every nation of the earth. Every nation has its god. It's an odd way of thinking from our point of view, but it was not an uncommon way of thinking for the ancient Israelites. So what's actually happening here is that God is judging the nation. And we also, as we look around at what happens in the world today, and especially, in these trying times, we also have this tendency to judge the nations. How is this nation doing? How is that nation doing? And what are the criteria that we use to judge the nations of the world? Oh, we look at power, we look at influence, we look at economic power. So this nation is doing well because they have all this economic power, they have this military strength, they have this influence on the world scale. Those are the kinds of things we look to when we want to judge nations. And sometimes we'll look at Canada and say, well, it doesn't have the influence or power, economic influence that we would like, and so we judge a nation poorly. These are not the criteria that God uses to judge the nations. This is what it says in verse 2. As God judges the nations of the world, how long will you judge unjustly and show partiality to the wicked? Give justice to the weak and the orphan. Maintain the right of the lowly and the destitute. Rescue the weak and the needy. Deliver them from the hand of the wicked. So, how does God judge the nations of the world? By how they treat the weakest and the most forgotten and those who have the fewest resources in their society. These are the criteria that God is using. And I think in some ways you could say that we are living in a time where God is judging the nations of the world, because when you go through something like a pandemic and some of the things that are going on in the world today, it's a stress test. It's a stress test for the nation. And how do you do? How do you manage under this kind of stress? And you know what? Many of the nations of the world are not doing well. Even as we roll out the vaccine, which we hope and pray will save us from this dire situation we've been living through, we see some of the cracks in societies as societies and cultures are not taking care of the weakest and most vulnerable. I heard a report today that China is not vaccinating people over 60. That sounds like a really problematic thing. As we look at some scandals that are taking place where powerful people, influential people, maybe celebrities in some cases, are getting access to the vaccine ahead of more vulnerable people. These are very foolish things that we do if we do not set our priorities straight. And I know that people get upset because we want to vaccinate prisoners, but they are extraordinary, in some ways not deserving. They haven't earned, special treatment, but they are living in a communitarian setting where they are more vulnerable for many reasons. We need to be looking after the vulnerable. It means, unfortunately, that some of us will have to wait longer then we have to. But if we do it in a way that takes care of the most vulnerable people first, you know what? Our country and our nations will be stronger and more resilient and recover better if we cover together and we bring along the most vulnerable. But you know what happens if you leave the vulnerable out of that equation? The disease lingers. The pandemic continues to spread. It continues to mutate. And we all understand, I think, now how dangerous those mutations could be. And we do not get out of this thing. A pandemic kind of situation puts us in this place where if we simply take care of ourselves, we lose and we fall under judgment. We need to take care of everyone, and we need to be looking to the most vulnerable and finding the most vulnerable first and taking care of them. God is judging the nations. Lord, let us not be found wanting in the way we take care of the poor, the forgotten, the vulnerable in our society. Amen.